Hi everyone. So today we're going to go over the arrow function examples that I wrote up. We're going to go through each of them, some of them as detailed as line by line, and hopefully it will clear up some confusion around arrow functions and how they differ from regular functions and how we use them in React. So first thing I wanted to do was show how to get to these exercises so that you can do them on your own. And if you are going to do them on your own, I would highly recommend doing them before you watch this video, of course. So I will be providing a link to the arrow functions examples. However, I'm going to go into the one I created for myself for the answers. And then when you get in there, you're just going to see a screen that looks like this. And you can go down to what's very small. Unfortunately, on the screen, it's pretty small, but it says fork, just like how in Replit and in GitHub, we would fork. You can fork your own project as well if you have an account in CodePen. And CodePen is completely free to sign up. So what I have in place already is CodePen is automatically going to give you your HTML, CSS, and JavaScript automatically. However, we're really only looking at JavaScript today, so we can close out of HTML and CSS. So I'm just going to bring this in just a little bit. And then we also don't need to be looking at the HTML because everything we're doing in the console. So I'm going to bring this up as well. And I grabbed there's a tiny button that says console here at the bottom to pull that open. So if I bring this up a bit, you can see the console so far. So we can see that I have my 3 examples and their answers already in place. So the first example, we're looking at an arrow function that only has one expression, and we're handling primitive data types. And if we remember, primitive data types is going to be stuff like strings, numbers, Booleans, and then more complex data types is going to be like arrays and objects because they're made up of the primitive data types. So the first example we have here is a very basic addition function. It just takes 2 parameters and you're going to add it together and return it. What this arrow function is a shorter form of is, and I'm going to uncomment this out. Well, I want to comment out that, but it's actually just the function. And again, we're passing into 2 parameters and returning a plus b. So how does this get turned into this? So basically, the big arrow is the indicator that this is an arrow function. And to the left of the arrow function is where you're passing in your parameters. You've seen before arrow functions that don't have the parentheses around it, so something like that. And that is allowed if it's only one parameter. However, when we have 0 or more than 1, we do need the parentheses. So by 0, I mean like there's no parentheses. If there's no parameters, it would just be an empty. And if there are more than 1, we would do a comma b and c and d and so on. You also could just do a wrapped in parentheses if you just have 1. That's totally fine as well. Most developers decide not to because the whole point of arrow functions is supposed to be as clean as possible. But we're adding so many different rules by making things as clean as possible. Like you need parentheses if it is if it isn't one parameter, and you don't need parentheses if it is, and all this stuff. So if you're trying to reduce complexity for yourself, keep parentheses. It's okay. So that is the left side. And then on the right side is where the function body is. And so currently, arrow functions are fantastic for single expressions. Things like quickly adding together 2 numbers or doing a quick map method for an array or doing a quick JSX. So because this is only a single expression, we don't need the return keyword. Actually, if I were to add return here, this would be an error. I'm pretty sure if we run this right now, I would get an error. Yeah, it's CodePen, maybe this wasn't the best choice, but CodePen keeps it pretty, it's not very obvious that there's an error. But yeah, so unexpected token, we can't have return. So we can remove that. I'm going to rerun it just so we can get rid of that large red box. And notice we also don't have curly brackets either. And we can do that because it's only one expression. The moment we do more than one, we are going to have to wrap that body inside of curly brackets, and we will need that return statement, but we will see that more when we move further on. And I keep saying one expression, but I realize I haven't explained that just yet. So an expression, again, is any like any sort of action, such as adding two numbers together, or console logging something, or displaying a piece of JSX, or calling a function and passing some data into it. That's a single action. So an expression is just a single action. And if you think about some of our more complex functions we've done, that's made up of several expressions. So if you just need one, you can use an arrow function without these curly brackets. So that is what an arrow function is basically. And then yes, so to reiterate, this is going to return, the sum of a plus b is going to be returned to sum. So we can see that here in my example 1, the result of exercise 1, if you're going to be adding together 5 and 4, the result of exercise 1 is 9. So that is what's happening there. So let's move on to some of the actual exercises. We're going to write an arrow function that accepts a name, meaning a string, and then we'll return hello name. So we can just do, let's call it const display name equals, and then the first thing we do is we need our parameters, which we're accepting just one variable, right? One piece of data. So we actually don't need parentheses in this case. So I can just say name, and then we do our big arrow, and then we do the function body, which is going to be, let's do a template string. Hello. Let's do our name. And let's add a little exclamation mark too. Okay. And then we're going to console log the result of the function. So console log display name, and I'll pass in Katie. And so if we run this now, we will see hello Katie is, and it's below the examples. So there is hello Katie. So that is an example of a one line. And then the next one is write an arrow function that accepts a string and returns the length of the string. So I'm going to call it const calculate length equals, and again, so we're passing in one parameter, and in this case, it's just going to be a string. So I'm going to call it lowercase string. And we are going to return the string dot length, right? Because that's a property of every string data type. And remember, we don't have to use the return keyword here because it is a single expression. And so we can just then console log this out. And let's make it more descriptive for us so that later on we're like, why does it just say a number. So I'll say the length of, I'll say hot dog is $, curly brackets, and then we'll call our function calculate length. That's another annoying thing about CodePen is it does not auto complete variable names. And then we're going to throw in hot dog. Okay, that should be good. So I'm going to clear this console because it does not refresh for us, and then run it again. And the length of hot dog is 6, which it is. So cool. Everything's looking good so far. Now we are going to write an arrow function that accepts 2 numbers and returns a smaller number. So we're back to accepting 2 numbers again, just like we did in our exercise before. But we're not going to be adding them together. We're going to be evaluating them. And we can do it in one expression. It sounds like we would use an if statement for this, right? But we can do it in one expression. So the way we would do that, let's set up our arrow function again. So I'm going to call it return smallest. And also, by the way, something like this, like checking 2 numbers and returning what's smaller, is such a common function in the working world because these kind of like little tiny utility functions are going to be used over and over again is a really big thing. So keep that in mind. So that's the name of our function. Now we are going to pass in our 2 parameters. Again, it is 2 parameters, so now we do need the parentheses. So I'm going to do a comma b. You can do x and y or whatever. Actually, I'm just for clarity, I am going to do x comma y. And then we do our big arrow, and then we do our function body. So how do we do this in one expression? Well, this would be when a ternary function comes in. A ternary function kind of takes an if-else statement and turns it into a one expression action. It's really nice, but it's also kind of confusing to look at. Just like how arrow functions are confusing to look at, ternary expressions are also very confusing to look at. But once you get more comfortable with these things over and over again, your brain will start reading it correctly. So you just need practice. So in this case, ternary function is made up of 3 parts, which is not surprising because it says ternary. I'm pretty sure that's spelled wrong. That's okay. I'm just going to do these. I have to keep typing. 1 is the expression or the conditional. Is x smaller than y? The second part is if true. And then the third part is if false. So the conditional is going to either evaluate to true or false. And then if it's true, the second part runs. If false, the third part runs. So the first part is that conditional. So we're going to say if x is smaller than, and we would use our smaller than sign, y. Then we use a question mark to separate it and go to the next part. So it's kind of like if you're thinking of this in like texting terms, so it'll be like, is x smaller than y question mark? So that kind of thing. And then we're going to return if x is smaller, then we will return x, which normally, if this was a like a regular function, an arrow function, we would be writing return x, but we don't need a return statement here. It's all implied. And then if it's false, then that means y is smaller. So we'll be returning y. So this looks just insane, right? So let's console log it out to make sure I did this correctly. Return smallest, and I'm going to pass in, let's do 4 and 11. And so 4 should be returning. And there's 4 right there. And we can also say, I can switch it around and maybe do like 11 and 4. And we can rerun, and it should still be 4. Yep, right there. So I know this looks pretty crazy, and it's one of those things you just have to get used to as you continue. But I think one of the best things you can do when you encounter something that is as shorthand as this is write out the long version. So the long version of return smallest would be what? It would be const return smallest equals, we'll call an anonymous function. And we'll pass in our 2 parameters, which is going to be x and y, and start our function body. And then we'll say if x is smaller than y, then we'll run what should happen if that's true, which in this case, we'll just say return x. And then we can either do our else return y, or in this case, because if, x, if this if conditional evaluate is true and it gets to here, it's going to automatically end this function, because return means like return it now and the function, we're not moving on. So we can also just say return y here, because that it won't get to here if this is true. And if this is false, then it's just like, okay, I'll return y because this is false. Okay, so that's like the long version of this, or this is the long version of that, yeah. And then kind of what you can do is when you write out the long version, then just start picking those pieces out. So it's like, okay, this is my conditional, so I'll pull this out. This is what happens when it's true, and this is what happens when it's false. You can pull those pieces back out and turn it back into your ternary. Okay, so let's now move on to array methods. We love array methods. We're going to use them all the time in React because so much of our data is going to be in arrays. So we're starting off with a pretty simple array. This is just an array of 5 numbers. And in this example, what we're doing is we are running the map method. And in each, recall that the map method is going to loop over every element. So the map method is pretty similar to a for loop. So kind of the long way of doing this is const multiplied numbers equals, and we would like make an empty array, and then we would do for let I equals 0, or sorry, equals 0, I is less than original numbers, it's unit 1 stuff. Oh, it's nums length. And then it's going to be 5 and an I plus plus. So this is our usual like looping through an array thing that we learned in unit 1. And then we'll just say like multiplied, copy and pasting this because these names are long. Multiplied numbers dot push, because we're pushing something into the array. And we'll take original nums element I, because that's the element we're currently on in the loop, and then multiplying it by 2. So we see that the answer originally for one expression array methods is 6, 10, 16, 18, 4. If I were to comment this line out and rerun it, we should see the exact same thing. So let's rerun. And yeah, we're seeing 6, 10, 16, 18, 4 again. So these 2 lines do the same thing, but this is just so much smaller than this. And so that's like, we have to create a whole new variable and then like push to it and all this stuff. So, I mean, I guess we're creating a whole new variable here, but that's basically kind of how to think about it, is that when we're mapping, the parameter that goes in is whatever element we're looping over currently. It's our original nums element I in our for loop. So I'm going to take this out. And so we're doing that map and we're going through, and like, let's say it's the first one. So number is going to equate to 3. That's our parameter. And then in the function body, you know, it's going to be whatever the number currently is, which right now it's 3, and multiplying it by 2, which is going to be 6, which we do see down here. And so that gets returned as the first element in multiplied numbers. And then it goes on to the next one. Now its number is going to be equal to 5. 5 times 2 equals 10. That gets sent back to multiplied numbers, and it just keeps looping over just like that. So that is our map array. And then this is another example of how you would use map, but without the arrow function. So kind of like an in-between state of that for loop we just did, and the arrow function right here. So there's so many different ways of doing the same thing. Okay, so let's move on to the exercises. So we're going to write an arrow function that's going to filter all odd numbers from the original nums array. And then we're going to create a new variable to hold the new array. So this is a second array method, and another one we're going to use a lot in React, which is the filter method. So I will say const filtered, actually let's call it odd nums. And we're going to equal it to, again, it's going to be the original nums. But this time, instead of mapping over it, we're going to filter it. But filter is once again looping through every single element. It's just only going to return the elements that filter evaluates as true based on the conditional we're passing in. So in this case, the conditional we're passing in, well, first of all, we have to put our parameter in, which is going to be num. And then, so num, of course, the first time is going to equal to 3, and then 5, and then 8, and it's going to keep looping through like that. So this time we're just going to say we're going to put a conditional in, which will evaluate to either true or false based on the number. And then filter is going to take, if it's true, return the original element, and if it's false, don't return it. So num, so we're going to do num. What's the way that we can filter even and odds? We can use that modulus, whatever, I don't know. So if the, or divided by 2, so if the num is divided by 2, if the remainder is 0 instead of 1, it'll be even. So actually in this case, because we only want the odd numbers back, we should do 1 instead of 0, because we want the remainder of what number divided by 2 is should be 1. That means it's odd. So let's double check that that works, and then we can break that down more of what we just did. Console log odd nums. Old nums is not. Hey, that's wrong. Okay, let's rerun that. Oops. Clear, not exit out. Run. Okay, so yeah, so we're going to see our array, which has the same numbers as above. We haven't manipulated them, but we've removed 8 and 2 because they're even numbers. Okay, but like this, what's going on here? So again, let's do the long way first. So that would be, instead of const odd nums, let's do it here. Const odd nums equals an array. We're going to loop through them again. We'll do for let I equals 0. I is going to be less than original nums dot length I plus plus. So again, that's like the way that we did arrays when we first learned. And I think a lot of you, that's like really cemented so far. Okay, and so we'll say if original nums element I, because that's kind of like our num in this case, it's whichever element we're looping over in the moment. If the remainder when divided by 2 equals 1, then we'll do odd, oh my goodness, Katie can't type, odd nums dot push, and we'll push in our original nums element I, the one that we're on currently. And then if not, we don't want to add it to our new odd nums array. So we're just going to let it be. We're not going to do anything. Let's clear that, rerun. Didn't like that actually. We're getting an empty array. So original, maybe I spelled something wrong. Always possible, especially because it doesn't tell me. Oh. Okay, so let I equal 0. I is less than the length of original nums, I plus plus. If original nums, element I 0, odd nums dot push. Oh, hey, it's supposed to be, it's push is a function, it's a method, so it should be parentheses and not square brackets. So let's run that. All right, and there they are. So those are their 3, the same 3 that we saw earlier. So again, you know, you can turn this into your parameter name for whatever your filter method is for the element name. And then you can pull this out because this is your, I'm gonna light this up so you can see it. You can pull out this expression, this conditional, and put it in here. And then filter takes care of the rest. It just knows implicitly that if this conditional is true, return, or the equivalent of pushing to our new array. And if not, then we're not going to do anything. So that is the equivalent here. Okay, so I'm going to clear that out. Okay. The next one we have is we are going to map again. And this time we're going to do, we're manipulating each string. So let's call this const new string. And we will say we're going to map over the existing one. So we'll call our map method. And then inside the long way, which we start doing a function, right? So we would do a function and then we would pass in the element that we're currently on, because again, map is looping through each one. So we can call it like word. And notice I'm doing it within these parentheses because this is function exists as a parameter we're passing into map, and the map is taking that and doing its manipulation of the string R array. Not really, it's not manipulating that array, it's creating a new one to return back. Sorry, my headphones turned off, but it should be working now. Okay, so this would be the long way. So then we'll just be like, we're going to return our, let's do a template string again and say $, curly brackets, say word, are cool. And then it'll be console log that new strings. Let's see if that works. Coded girls are cool, penguins are cool, books are cool. Great. So now let's turn this into an arrow function, right? So keep my const below that so we can, or my console log. So we can do const new strings equals stir r. That's the same, but now we're going to make this an arrow function. So we're going to pull out. Actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to manipulate this like directly in there so you can see me just like transform a regular function into an arrow function. So we're literally pulling out the word function. And we're replacing the big arrow. No, so this actually works right now because we have a return statement here and we've got curly brackets. Yeah, so this works, but we can make it even more efficient because this is one expression. So we can first remove our curly brackets because if you have curly brackets, you can't have return, and if you have return, you can't have curly brackets. It's like coupled together. And then you can choose to keep your parentheses around your parameter or not. Just for cleanliness sake, I'm going to remove it. And so that is how we just took the long function and turned it into the arrow function. And again, there is our manipulated strings. So, all right, so moving on. We're going to write an arrow function that maps over the original nums again. So that same 5 as before. I'm going to pull it down actually so we can see them, so we know what to expect. So we're going to map over the original nums, and if it is odd, we will add 5. If it's even, we'll add 2. And again, this is something we can do in one expression for the same reason as before, because we can use a ternary operator. So let's do this. We're just going to do it without doing the long way, before or after. So I'm running out of good names. Odd nums. Let's call this odd even nums, just in case I want to use new nums later. Yeah, these names aren't great. And we're mapping this. It specifically says map, so we'll do original nums.map. And then again, we're going to name name the parameter that's going to represent the element. So in this case, because they're all numbers, we can just call it num. And it's singular versus plural. Have our big arrow function or big arrow, and then in the function body is when we do our conditional and our manipulation. So we'll do num divided by 2. If it equals 0, that means it's even. So then that's our first part of our ternary. So then we use a question mark to say that's the conditional is done. Let's move to the true, if true. And if it's even, we're going to add 2, it says. So we'll say num plus 2. Remember, this is because it's an arrow function with one expression, we don't need to use a return statement. And then if false, we'll use that colon and say num plus 5. And then we're going to console log odd, even nums. Let's see how that looks. Okay, so, you know, if it's odd, we're adding 5, and we can see that here with the 3, add 5 is 8, the 10, add 5 is 10, the 9, add 5 is 14, and then with evens, it's at 2, so 8 becomes 10, and 2 becomes 4. So, yeah, that is the shorthand way of doing it. Okay, so now for the last part, let's look at multiple expressions. This is something that really comes into play with updating state in React. We can't, if we're going to use like that pre-state parameter, we can't really manipulate it in one expression. So we have to use multiple expressions. And really the big difference is just what we saw before, is we are going to have to wrap it in curly brackets so that all expressions are going to be held in that block. And then we will need the return statement. So what we're doing here is we're first adding 2 to each number and then multiplying it by 10, which we can see here. 3 becomes 5 and then 50, 5 becomes 7 and then 70, etc. So that is what's happening in this map here, and it's just returning back that number. And I wanted to also point out, because this is something I ran into, and it's something I think we're going to run into a lot in our state updates of React, is if you're returning an object value, not just like the object variable name, but an object value where you're wrapping it like this, you'll actually need to wrap it in the curly brackets and use the return keyword, even if it's a single expression. This is presumably because objects already use curly brackets. So, you know, JavaScript won't let you just like use curly brackets without, maybe it's not an expression fully or something. I haven't researched it, but it got mad at me. So what I learned is that you can't just do, let me uncomment this out. We can't like map over an array of objects. I didn't create example array. It's just, let's just pretend it's an array of objects. We're mapping over it, which each element is object. And then like, let's say we were trying to add the will this work parameter. You can't just like spread out the properties and tack on a new one like I thought you could. Instead, you have to actually wrap it in another set of curly brackets and use the return. And then you can do the will this work property and add it. So that's just something to keep in mind as we continue working in React. The next exercise is we're going to write an arrow function that's going to add a third property to each object in this D&D array, which if anyone knows me, you know that I'm really into D&D and Critical Role, so I added it to these exercises. And if you don't, that's okay. You don't need to know it. So we're just going to be updating the existing array in this instance rather than making a new variable. That's why I use let instead of const. And then we'll console log the results. So we're going to say d and dr equals, it's the same kind of thing we were doing before, where we're going to map over each item. Again, we need a parameter name to represent the element, so I will call it person, because each of these people, each object is a person, a fictional character, but a person nonetheless. And then we will do our arrow function. And again, we can't do just spreading out the object and then adding say mighty 9 member true, this will be an error. So what we'll have to do is wrap it in another set of curly brackets and return it. And let's console log that out, see if it works. DNDR. Oh, because I was previously calling it object, but we're actually spreading out object, not, or we're spreading out person, not object. So that would be why that didn't work. Yeah, so now we see that each object now has a third property on it, mighty 9 member. So what is happening here? So this is a JavaScript, another JavaScript shorthand for us. That's actually, it's way better than just like the simple shorthand, because this also allows us to use data that's dynamic without having to know what's in the data. Because this just basically takes an object and is going to spread out. It's going to pull it out, the properties outside of the object, and return it as individual properties, which is great, because if we didn't have this, what would happen is that we would be returning an object within another object nested in it with this stuff, and then the outer object would be holding mighty 9 member true. So let's take a look at that, because I know that sounded confusing. We run this again. So now we have a person object that's been created with the original data, and then in the outer object, it's a mighty 9 member true. So that's not what we're looking for. So we need to spread out the individual properties so that when we return it, we're returning it all bundled together with all the properties on the same level, instead of like this nested object thing. Okay. So we're going to still use the same array. And now we are going to make a new variable that's going to hold all of the individuals that have the class cleric. As you see, there's going to be 2 of them. So we should expect to see an array of 2 elements at the end. So we'll say clerics equals dndr dot, and then are we using map here, or are we using a different one? Because we're now changing the number of elements, we want to use filter, because now we're like actually removing data. So we're going to use filter, and we don't have to do the funky return thing here, because we're not manipulating the objects themselves. We're just seeing what's in the objects and determining if the conditional will evaluate true or false. So again, we'll need a parameter name to represent our element, and that is going to be, we'll use person again. We'll do our arrow function. And so in the body of the filter method, we want a conditional, not a manipulation of the data, but just a conditional to see if the data meets the condition or not. And so in this case, we'll say person class, oh my gosh, equals cleric, because that's the, yeah. So this is a conditional. It's going to evaluate true or false. And so if the person's class is cleric, it's going to get added to this new cleric array, which, hey, I got to put const in front of that. I'm declaring a new variable. And if their class is not cleric, they're not going to get added. So again, filter is not a manipulation of data like map is. It is a determination of whether or not some data should be included. So let's console log clerics, clear you out and run it. And now we see we just have an array of two, it doesn't let me go any further, does it? Of two items, that's just Jester and Caduceus, because they're both of the clerics. Okay, and so the last thing we're gonna do is we're going to organize the original array with all 5 members and sort them alphabetically by name. There is a sort method. However, we're going to try the sort method actually. We're going to, and this is going to be fun because I did not practice this one before I started this video. So we'll see how this goes. Alpha, let's call it alpha, D&D. And then we'll do D&D R, and then we'll use the sort method. And I am going to go check out the sort docs because I'm not that familiar with it actually. So let's see, we'll go to MDM sort array because they have the best documentation for array methods. Sorts the elements of an array in place and returns the sorted array. It's full. But we can't, so you could just do sort without passing anything into it. But that's just going to take it's only going to sort it like alphabetically by ASCII code. Like months, obviously December is not the first month, but it is alphabetically, so that's why December gets first here. So we don't want that. We want to actually pass in a function to compare them both and return what should be first, I believe. Specifies a function that defines the sort order. Yeah, if omitted, the array element is converted to strings and then sorted according to Unicode. That's why we were seeing December 1st instead of January. So the first element for comparison versus the second element. This is, okay. Okay, so let's do long way first and then short way. Be a couple attempts. Sort. So we're going to actually be passing 2 elements in here, which means we will need a second set of parentheses. So we'll call it person A, person B. And then we will do our long way. So we'll do function. Oh, if we're doing that, then we need function over here. And then we'll do our curly brackets. And then we'll say if person A dot name is I think we can do smaller than and less than because of the Unicode, because Unicode does have all of the letters alphabetically. So like A will be before B in terms of Unicode. I think it's like 65 versus 66. So I think I can do person B dot name. So then we'll say return person A. So it's kind of like the filter we did before. And then instead we'll say return person B. Okay, and then we console log this out. Alpha D&D. See what happens. This could fall over. Not 100% sure. Okay. It ignored me completely, it looks like, because this is the original order, but we should be seeing Caduceus first instead of Caleb. Actually, we should be seeing Bo first because she's B. So now we're going to use my friend console log. So we're going to say console log person A, console log person B, and then I know what will happen is we'll just keep, we want to separate it in the console, so we'll just say like new loop, so that way the person A and person B is separated. And then if, so I want to make sure, what I'm doing is I'm trying to make sure that, actually let's do person A dot name. The elements I'm expecting to see are I'm seeing. And that's what's so great about console log. Oh, I should have commented that out because we knew it was going to fail. Yeah. So new loop, we get our first, oh, that's interesting that we get the first person we get is the second one. I guess it doesn't really matter, but yeah. Okay, so we are seeing what I'm expecting to see. So now I think my question is just how to tell it to sort alphabetic, like to choose which one is the higher name in the alphabetical order. So let's go to JavaScript, sort alphabetically. See what happens. Stack Overflow is our friend, but we do have to get used to figuring out what's a good answer and what's a bad answer. It's good to look for the number of points. This is a good one. It's over 1,000, and there's a green check mark, which means this is correct. So we also have a sort function going on here. Oh. So we should be returning if negative, the first argument is negative. It should return something negative if the first argument is less than the second, something positive if the first argument is greater. Interesting. Does that match what it is? So we shouldn't have been doing true or false. We should have been using -1 and 1. Interesting. Okay, back to where we were at. So if person's name, and that's what he was using, yes. Then we will say return -1, else return 1. And we could do the 0, but in this case, we know there's not going to be any duplicate names. So I'm not going to worry about that. So I'm going to clear that out. We're going to run it again. Oh, I didn't actually have my console log in place. That's important. Can't see anything if it's commented out. Okay, that is correct. We have Bo, Caduceus, Caleb, for Jester. So everything is now organized correctly. So how do we do this as an arrow function? Well, we can just pull out. Let's actually just do it right in here. Let's transform this into our arrow function. And remember, at this point, just by removing the word function and putting in the big arrow, this still works, but we can make it even smaller by pulling out, and we're going to be basically be doing a ternary, it looks like. So I'm going to comment this out, put our, I'm just pasted back in that same conditional that we had before. And so ternary is first part is our conditional. And then we use a question mark to say, I'm done with my conditional. Let's go to this. If true, we will then be -1. And then if false, we'll do 1. And it looks like if we did want to include that 0, if they're equal, we would have to move away from doing multiple expressions, which I guess this is the multiple expression area. So we could do that as well. But we can do it in 1, I'm pretty sure. Let's see what happens. Oh, we got an error. Unexpected comma, which doesn't actually mean unexpected comma. It just means I didn't close the array, the method. That's important. So let's rerun. And everything's working. And everyone's ordered correctly too. So that is that. And that's how I handle not knowing the answer to something. I will, go on Google and start looking up the answers and using documentation to figure out what I'm supposed to do. And as you saw, I assumed via filter it was going to be a true false, but that's actually not the case. Sort expects a negative or positive numeral in order to determine how to sort an array. So now we know. So that is the arrow function examples. I hope that this shines some light. You can always message me on Slack if you have any questions. And yeah, that is all. Talk to y'all later.